15,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. August 17th, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Hayes is screaming toward the jungle canopy in a vertical power dive, his airspeed indicator vibrating past 420 miles per hour. Directly in his crosshairs sits a Mitsubishi A6M Zero. To kill it, Hayes needs to make one simple correction, a hard bank to the right. He grips the yoke of his P-38 Lightning with both hands and slams it over. Nothing happens. The stick feels like it is set in concrete. At these speeds, the airflow over the huge ailerons has become a physical wall, requiring over 200 pounds of force to move. Hayes isn't fighting the Japanese anymore. He is fighting the laws of aerodynamics, and he is losing. The Zero snaps away effortlessly, leaving Hayes trembling, bathed in sweat, and dangerously close to the ground. He is flying the most advanced fighter in the Pacific, yet in this dive, he is nothing more than a passenger. To understand how a rogue mechanic turned this plummeting brick into the deadliest dancer of the Pacific War, we have to look inside the wing itself. Inside that aluminum skin, hidden among the ribbing and control rods, was a conflict of engineering that no manual could resolve. The P-38 Lightning was a masterpiece of American industrial might twin booms, twin Allison V1000, 710 engines, and enough firepower in the nose to saw a destroyer in half. But against the Japanese Zero, it suffered from a lethal identity crisis. The Zero was a kite made of magnesium and desperate minimalism. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a wing loading, the ratio of aircraft weight to wing area that was laughably low. This meant the Zero could dance, it could turn on a dime, it could loop inside a phone booth. The P-38, by contrast, was a muscle car. It was heavy, fast, and built for straight-line domination. When a P-38 pilot tried to turn with a Zero, physics took over. The heavy American fighter would drift wide, bleeding energy, while the nimble Japanese fighter simply pivoted, cut across the diameter of the turn, and latched onto the Lightning's tail. The result was always the same: smoking engines and a parachute over the jungle. 5th Air Force Command knew this. Their solution was doctrine. The orders were typed out in crisp, bureaucratic font: engage only from altitude, dive, fire, climb, never turn. It was called boom and zoom. On paper, it was perfect. In the chaos of a dogfight over New Guinea, it was a death sentence. The problem wasn't the strategy, it was the execution. To boom and zoom effectively, you need to line up your shot during a dive at 400 miles per hour. But the Japanese pilots were veterans. They didn't fly straight and level waiting to be shot. When they saw a P-38 diving on them, they would snap roll a violent sudden bank to the left or right. To follow that maneuver and get guns on target, the American pilot had to match that roll instantly. And that is where the P-38 betrayed its pilots. At low speeds, the P-38's control wheel was light and responsive. But as the airspeed indicator climbed past 300, 350, and 400 miles per hour, the air rushing over the massive ailerons, the hinged flaps on the trailing edge of the wing, that control roll became thick like hydraulic fluid. The aerodynamic pressure clamping down on those control surfaces was immense. This phenomenon is known as control stiffening. When Lieutenant Hayes sees the Zero brake right and tries to follow, he isn't just turning a wheel. He is fighting thousands of pounds of air pressure pinning the aileron flush with the wing. He is hauling on the yoke with both hands, boots braced against the instrument panel, veins popping in his neck, trying to leverage a mechanical system that simply refuses to budge. The aircraft responds, but agonizingly slowly, a slow roll that takes 3 or 4 seconds. In aerial combat, 3 seconds is an eternity. In 3 seconds, the Zero is gone. In 3 seconds, the hunter becomes the prey. On the humid tarmac of Dobodura Airfield, Technical Sergeant James McKenna watched this tragedy play out on a daily loop. He was a line chief, a man whose hands were permanently stained with oil and whose ears were tuned to the specific cough of a supercharged engine. He didn't fly the missions, but he cleaned the blood out of the cockpits when they returned. McKenna listened to the pilots. He heard the same frantic debriefing over and over. "I had him," a shaking 20-year-old lieutenant would say, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "I had him cold. He broke left. I tried to follow, but the stick, it was like it was stuck in cement. I couldn't get the nose around. The engineering officers, men with college degrees, who worked in air-conditioned offices in Brisbane or Dayton, dismissed these reports. They pointed to the technical orders. They pointed to the static tests. The cables are tensioned correctly, they would say. The pilot is freezing up. It's pilot error. It's combat fatigue. McKenna knew better. He knew these boys. They weren't cowards. They were wrestling a machine that became paralyzed exactly when they needed it most. The arrival of the new P-38J model was supposed to fix this. It came equipped with a factory-installed hydraulic booster system for the ailerons, essentially power steering for the airplane. A hydraulic pump would take the pilot's input and amplify it, using fluid pressure to force the ailerons into the airstream, overcoming the resistance. It should have been the silver bullet. But when the first J models arrived in theater, the pilots came back with the same haunted look. The roll rate was better, but it was still sluggish. The aircraft still felt heavy. The feel wasn't right. McKenna spent his nights with a flashlight clamped in his teeth, staring at the hydraulic schematics of the new booster assembly. He traced the fluid lines from the reservoir to the actuating cylinder. He studied the bell cranks and the pressure relief valves. That's when he saw it, the factory tolerance. Lockheed engineers, terrified that a clumsy pilot might rip the wings off the airplane if the controls were too sensitive, had choked the system. They had installed restrictor valves and set the hydraulic pressure well below the system's maximum capacity. They had engineered a safety buffer. They had built a limousine when the pilots needed a rally car. The fatal flaw wasn't a broken part, it was a philosophy. The engineers in California were prioritizing the structural lifespan of the aluminum wing. McKenna, wiping sweat from his eyes in the suffocating New Guinea heat, was prioritizing the lifespan of the man inside it. The manual was clear. Field modification of hydraulic pressure settings is strictly prohibited. Violation is a court-martial offense. McKenna looked at the schematic. Then he looked at Sgt Hayes, who was sitting on a crate by the hangar, staring at a picture of a girl back in Iowa, wondering if he'd survive tomorrow's patrol. McKenna picked up his toolbox. The manual was about to be rewritten. That manual was written in Burbank, California, by men who went home to their families at 5 o'clock. Technical Sergeant McKenna was rewriting it in a humid canvas tent in New Guinea, where the only way home was through a wall of Japanese flak. The legend of this moment has been distorted by time. If you ask an old-timer at an air show, they'll tell you McKenna fixed the P-38 with a stupid wire trick that he simply tightened a loose cable with a piece of piano wire, removing the slack. It's a romantic story. The blue-collar genius tightening a screw the experts missed. But the truth is far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. McKenna wasn't just tightening a cable, he was hacking the nervous system of the aircraft. The P-38J had just introduced a complex new heart, the hydraulic aileron booster unit. Think of it like power steering in a 1,940 truck. Without it, turning the wheels requires brute strength. With it, hydraulic fluid under immense pressure does the heavy lifting for you. The system worked by using a control valve. When the pilot moved the stick, the valve opened, rushing pressurized red fluid into a cylinder that pushed the aileron up or down. But Lockheed had deliberately designed slop into this valve, a mechanical delay. They called it a deadband. The logic was sound for peacetime flying. A sensitive valve meant that a nervous pilot's trembling hand could send the plane into a violent roll, overstressing the airframe or causing a snap stall. The deadband acted as a filter, ignoring small, twitchy inputs and ensuring smooth, gentlemanly flying characteristics. But in a dogfight, you don't want a gentleman, you want a knife fighter. That deadband was the split second of hesitation that was getting Lieutenant Hayes killed. When Hayes slammed the stick left to track a zero, the valve hesitated. It waited to make sure he really meant it. By the time the hydraulics engaged, the moment was gone. McKenna's solution was heretical because it removed the safety catch on a loaded weapon. Under the cover of darkness, illuminated only by the red filtered lens of his angle-head flashlight, McKenna cracked open the inspection panel on the P-38's twin boom. The smell of hot aluminum and acrid hydraulic fluid filled the humid night air. He wasn't authorized to touch the internal valve assembly. If he stripped a nut, if he introduced a bubble of air into the lines, the ailerons could lock hard over in flight, spinning the aircraft into the jungle until it disintegrated. He didn't care. He reached into the guts of the booster mechanism. McKenna wasn't adding a wire. He was altering the geometry of the linkage itself. He took the bell crank, the metal arm that transferred the pilot's stick movement to the hydraulic valve, and he began to file down the stop pins. He drilled a new attachment point closer to the fulcrum. This was simple, high-stakes physics. By changing the leverage point, he was amplifying the input signal. He was tricking the valve into opening sooner and wider than the factory ever intended. It was a surgical procedure performed with a metal file and a pair of calipers. He shaved fractions of an inch off the restrictor mechanism. He tightened the tolerance of the control rod until the dead band vanished entirely. Most mechanics would have stopped there. But McKenna went further. He bypassed the pressure relief setting. The factory set the system to operate at a conservative pressure to save wear on the pumps. McKenna cranked it up. He wanted the hydraulics to hit the ailerons with the violence of a jackhammer. For 3 hours, the only sound in the hangar was the scrape of the file and the rhythmic breathing of a man committing a court-martial offense. When he finished, he wiped the grease from his hands and climbed into the cockpit to test it. In a standard P-38, the stick had a bit of mush, a soft zone in the center where nothing happened. McKenna grabbed the yoke of Hayes's fighter. He moved it a millimeter to the left. Clack. The aileron outside snapped instantly. There was no hesitation, no mush. The controls felt electric, alive. The buffer was gone. The result was an aircraft that was technically unstable. A sneeze, while flying this plane, could put it into a 60-degree bank. A clumsy pilot could easily rip the tail off by over-controlling at high speed. McKenna had stripped away the safety features that protected the pilot from the plane, in exchange for the performance that would protect the pilot from the enemy. He climbed down from the wing, sealed the inspection panel, and falsified the maintenance log. He wrote, "Routine inspection. All systems within nominal parameters." He didn't tell the engineering officer. He didn't wire Lockheed for permission. He didn't even tell Lieutenant Hayes the specifics. He just walked up to the young pilot on the flight line as the sun began to rise over the Owen Stanley Range. Hayes looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, dreading another mission in the lead sled. McKenna leaned in, his voice dropping below the roar of the warming engines. "Lieutenant," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's going to feel different today, sensitive. Don't fight her. Just think about turning, and she'll turn. But for God's sake, keep your hand steady." Hayes nodded, confused but too tired to argue. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and taxied out. McKenna stood by the wheel chocks, watching the twin booms shudder as the throttles advanced. He had just bet his career, and Robert Hayes's life, on a fraction of an inch of filed steel. The test wouldn't happen in a wind tunnel. It would happen at 20,000 feet, with live ammunition. As the twin engines of Lieutenant Hayes's Lightning faded into a dull throb against the jungle canopy, the silence that rushed back into the revetment felt heavier than the noise. Technical Sergeant McKenna stood amidst the scattered tools of his crime, the metal filings, the hydraulic fluid rags, the altered pressure gauges, and felt the cold prickle of exposure. He wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the hardstand was Captain Reynolds, the squadron engineering officer. Reynolds was everything McKenna was not. Clean-shaven, uniform strictly regulation, a man who viewed the war through the pristine lens of a clipboard. He stared at the hydraulic test rig McKenna hadn't yet stowed away. The pressure valve was still dialed past the red line. Reynolds walked over, his boots crunching on the coral gravel. He looked at the gauge, then at McKenna. The air between them crackled with the unspoken hierarchy of the Army Air Forces. "That setting is 30% over spec, Sergeant," Reynolds said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Technical Order 01-75 clearly states the maximum PSI for the aileron boost circuit. You're running it hot. This was the system of rejection in flesh and blood. It wasn't that the Army didn't want better planes. It was that they were terrified of the physics involved. The P-38 was a structural paradox. It was incredibly strong, but it was also prone to compressibility and tail flutter. The engineers at Wright-Patterson and Lockheed believed that if you gave a pilot instant, boosted control at 400 miles per hour, the sudden G-load would be catastrophic. They feared aeroelastic twisting. If the aileron snapped up too fast, the force could literally twist the entire wing in the opposite direction, or worse, snap the main spar like a dry twig. The dead band and the low pressure were there to protect the airframe from the pilot. "I'm giving him a fighting chance, sir," McKenna replied, wiping his hands. "The stock valves are getting them killed. They can't roll." Reynolds stepped closer. You aren't an aeronautical engineer, McKenna. You're a mechanic. You don't know what that pressure does to the seal integrity at 20,000 feet. You don't know the stress load on the bell cranks. I know Lieutenant Hayes has come back with holes in his tail 3 times this week because he couldn't turn. McKenna shot back. The exhaustion was making him reckless. I know the Zeros are laughing at us. If that aircraft suffers a hydraulic failure, Reynolds cut in, his voice rising, or if Hayes pulls the wings off in a high G maneuver because you remove the safety limits, that isn't a combat loss. That is manslaughter. And you will be in Leavenworth making little rocks out of big ones for the next 20 years. The threat hung in the humid air. This was the wall every innovator in the Pacific hit. The disconnect between the paper war fought with manuals, liability, and preservation of assets, and the real war fought with instinct and desperation. To Reynolds, the P-38 was $1 million government asset that needed to be preserved according to the manufacturer's warranty. To McKenna, it was a disposable tool that was useless if it couldn't kill. Reynolds pulled a notepad from his pocket. I'm going to inspect that aircraft the moment it touches down. If I find unauthorized modifications to the flight control system, I'm filing charges. Pray he brings it back in one piece, Sergeant, for your sake. Reynolds turned and walked back toward the ops tent. McKenna watched him go. The system had spoken. The logic of the bureaucracy was sound. Safety first. But in the skies over the Huon Gulf, safety was a lie. There was no safety in a cockpit when a 20mm cannon shell was smashing through your canopy. McKenna looked up at the empty sky. He had stripped away the margin for error. He had turned Hayes' plane into a hair-trigger weapon. If Hayes panicked, if he jerked that sensitive stick too hard in a dive, the hydraulics would instantly apply thousands of pounds of force. The wings might indeed snap off. McKenna realized with a sick feeling in his gut that Reynolds might be right. He might have just killed the kid he was trying to save. For the next 2 hours, McKenna didn't move from the flight line. He paced the crushed coral, chain-smoking, scanning the northern horizon. The system had rejected his solution. The engineering officer had condemned it. Now, the only court that mattered was in session at 15,000 feet, where the laws of physics were about to hand down a verdict. That verdict arrived at 8:15 a.m., wrapped in the roar of 2 supercharged Allison engines screaming at emergency power. Lieutenant Hayes was alone at 18,000 feet, detached from his wingman in the blinding glare of the morning sun. Below him, the jungle was a green blur. Above him, the sky was an indifferent blue void. And directly ahead, banking hard to cut off his escape, were 2 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. Hayes knew the script. He had lived through this scene half a dozen times. The lead Zero was already rolling inverted, starting a high-speed diving turn to get onto Hayes' 6 o'clock position. The Japanese pilot, confident in his machine's superior agility, was executing a textbook trap. He expected the heavy American fighter to continue straight, or perhaps try a shallow, sluggish turn that would leave its belly exposed to 20mm cannon fire. Hayes' hands were sweating inside his leather gloves. The airspeed indicator read 380 miles per hour. In a standard P-38, this was the coffin corner, fast enough to compress the air, stiffening the controls until the yoke felt like it was welded to the dashboard. But Hayes remembered the grease-stained face of Sgt McKenna in the pre-dawn dark. Just think about turning, and she'll turn. Hayes didn't think, he reacted. He saw the Zero's wing dip. Instinct took over. He slammed the yoke hard to the left. He expected resistance. He expected the usual 2-second delay as his muscles fought the airstream. He braced his body for the struggle. Instead, the P-38 exploded into motion. With the restrictor valves filed down and the pressure limiters bypassed, the hydraulic fluid didn't trickle into the actuators, it detonated into them. There was no deadband. There was no gentlemanly hesitation. The aileron slammed into the slipstream with thousands of pounds of hydraulic force, instantly overpowering the aerodynamic resistance that had plagued the aircraft for years. The result was so violent that Hayes' head slammed against the plexiglass canopy. The horizon didn't just tilt, it spun 90 degrees in a heartbeat. The G-force hit him like a physical blow to the chest, driving the air from his lungs. The P-38 didn't bank, it snapped. In the cockpit of the lead Zero, the Japanese pilot must have blinked in disbelief. One moment, the American flying brick was plodding forward. A fraction of a second later, it was knife-edge vertical, cutting strictly inside the Zero's turning circle. The geometry of the fight had been rewritten instantly. The Zero pilot, realizing his mistake, tried to reverse his turn, the scissors maneuver that had killed so many Americans. He snapped his stick right, expecting the P-38 to overshoot. But Hayes was already there. Because McKenna had eliminated the slop in the bell crank, Hayes could reverse his turn with fingertip pressure. He flicked the yoke right. The hydraulics hammered the ailerons again. The P-38 whipped back to the right, tracking the Zero with terrifying precision. The heavy fighter wasn't floating. It was pointing. Hayes pressed the trigger. 50 caliber machine guns and the central 20mm cannon in the nose converged on the Zero. At this range, barely 200 yards, there was no need for lead calculation. The stream of fire sawed through the Zero's wing root. The Mitsubishi disintegrated, turning into a fireball of magnesium and aviation fuel that tumbled past Hayes's canopy. 1 kill. Hayes gasped for air, his vision graying out at the edges from the G-load. The structural groans of the airframe were audible over the engine roar, the screech of metal rivets straining against the sudden, violent torque. Captain Reynolds had been right about one thing. The stress on the wings was immense. The main spar was flexing, vibrating under loads it was never tested for. But the wings held. The second Zero, seeing his wingman vaporized by a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible, abandoned the attack and dove for the deck. Hayes pulled back on the stick, converting his speed into altitude, climbing back into the sun. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, but not from the strain of fighting the controls. They were shaking from the adrenaline of realizing he was no longer driving a truck. He was flying a weapon. The concrete stick was gone. In its place was a hydraulic sledgehammer. Hayes keyed his throat mic, his voice cracking with the sheer shock of survival. Blue flight, this is Blue 3. Splash 10. Controls are active. Repeat, controls are extremely active. He banked the fighter toward Dobodura, treating the stick with a new, fearful respect. He had survived the combat test, but the real danger was waiting on the ground. The aircraft he was flying was now illegal. The rivets popping from the stress of that snap roll were evidence of a crime. And standing on the tarmac, notebook in hand, was the engineering officer who had promised to court-martial the man who made it possible. Hayes lowered the nose, letting gravity pull him back toward the judgment of men who had never felt a Zero on their tail. The tires of Lieutenant Hayes's P-38 squealed against the pierced steel planking of the runway, kicking up a cloud of coral dust that settled over the waiting ground crew. As the prop spun down to a halt, the silence returned to Dobodura, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was electric. Technical Sgt McKenna stood by the wing, wiping his oily hands on a rag, watching the cockpit canopy crank open. He wasn't looking at the pilot. He was looking at Captain Reynolds, who was already marching toward the aircraft, his face set in a grim line of bureaucratic anticipation. Hayes climbed out slowly. He didn't hop down with the usual swagger of a fighter jockey. He slid down the ladder, his legs visibly shaking, his flight suit dark with sweat. He looked like a man who had just wrestled a bear and won. Reynolds bypassed the pilot and went straight to the left boom. He ran his hand along the aluminum skin near the wing root. He stopped. The metal was rippled, oil-canned, wrinkled like an accordion from the sheer violence of the G-forces McKenna's modification had unleashed. "Look at this," Reynolds barked, pointing at the stress marks. "You overstressed the main beam. You warped the skin. This aircraft is grounded. Sergeant McKenna, you are relieved of duty pending a—" "It works," Hayes interrupted. His voice was quiet, hoarse, but it cut through the captain's tirade like a knife. Reynolds turned. "Excuse me, Lieutenant. It works," Hayes said again, louder this time, pulling off his leather helmet. He looked at McKenna, then at the officer. "I was dead, Captain. 2 zeros, 6 o'clock, high side. They had the drop. In any other plane on this line, I'd be burning in the jungle right now. But this one," she snapped. "She rolled so fast, I almost blacked out." Hayes walked over to the wrinkled aluminum, placing his hand over the damage. "I don't care if it bent the skin. I don't care if we have to replace the wings every 10 missions. I killed him. I turned inside a Zero, and I killed him." The gathering crowd of mechanics and pilots fell silent. This was the vindication of the front line against the paper war. The popped rivets weren't evidence of negligence. They were the scars of survival. Reynolds looked at the pilot, then at the gun camera cassette being pulled from the nose. He looked at the wrinkled wing. He knew the regulations. He knew the engineering limits. But he also knew that the 475th Fighter Group had lost 4 pilots the previous week to to the exact scenario Hayes had just survived. The logic of the manual had collided with the logic of the kill. Reynolds closed his notebook. He turned to McKenna, his jaw tight. "Inspect the hydraulic lines for leaks, Sergeant. If the pressure holds, get the rest of the flight ready." It wasn't an official approval that would never come in writing, but it was a surrender. The dam had broken. By that evening, the McKenna tune-up was no longer a secret. It was a contagion. Pilots from other squadrons drifted over to the maintenance tents, carrying bottles of whiskey and packs of cigarettes, bribing crew chiefs to take a look at their hydraulics. They didn't ask for details, they just wanted the Hayes special. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Across the 5th Air Force, the P-38 Lightning began to shed its reputation as a flying brick. The intricate filing of valve pins and the bypassing of pressure limiters spread from Dobodura to Port Moresby. It wasn't authorized by Lockheed. It wasn't sanctioned by Washington. It was sanctioned by the results. The change was invisible to the eye. The planes looked exactly the same, but to the Japanese, it was as if the Americans had suddenly fielded a new superweapon. Combat reports from the Japanese naval air groups at Rabaul began to reflect a growing confusion. Veteran aces like Saburo Sakai, who had spent years mocking the P-38's sluggishness, suddenly found their prey behaving unpredictably. The American heavy fighters weren't running anymore. They were engaging. They were rolling into turns with a violence that defied the known performance data of the P-38. The math of death began to invert. In early 1943, the kill ratio in the Southwest Pacific had been dangerously close to even. By late 1943, with the arrival of the boosted tactics and aggressive pilots like Major Thomas McGuire and Richard Bong utilizing the aircraft's newfound agility, the ratio spiraled in America's favor. The P-38 wasn't just outdiving the Zero. It was now slashing through Japanese formations with a roll rate that allowed for instantaneous direction changes. The Zero's primary advantage, its agility, had been nullified not by a new engine, but by a mechanic who understood that a pilot's reaction time is useless if the machine can't keep up. General George Kenney, the commander of the 5th Air Force, eventually caught wind of the modifications. When he visited the flight lines and saw the oil-canned wings and the filed-down valve stops, he didn't court-martial anyone. He simply asked one question: are we winning? When the answer was yes, he turned a blind eye to the technical orders. The rebellious innovation loop was complete. The solution had moved from heresy to desperate experiment to unspoken standard operating procedure. McKenna never got a medal for the modification. The boosted ailerons would eventually become a standard factory feature in the P-38 Leader's model, a year later, refined, safe, and approved by engineers who claimed credit for the discovery. But the pilots of the 1943 campaign knew the truth. They knew that the responsiveness of their machines, the twitchy, violent power that allowed them to snap roll into a kill shot, didn't come from a factory in California. It came from a file, a flashlight, and a mechanic who refused to let the manual stand in the way of bringing his boys home. That manual didn't stay rewritten in the field. It eventually made its way back to Burbank, carried in the combat reports of pilots who were suddenly coming home alive. When Lockheed finally released the P-38 Leader's model in 1944, the definitive version of the Lightning, it arrived with a factory-standard, fully optimized hydraulic aileron booster system. The engineers had finally caught up to the sergeant. They had institutionalized the heresy. They added the dive flaps to cure compressibility and tuned the hydraulics to give the pilot that electric feel McKenna had carved out with a metal file in the dark. The P-38 Leaders went on to become the deadliest variant of the war, producing more aces in the Pacific theater than any other American fighter. But history has a way of smoothing over the rough edges of truth. If you look for this story today, you will often find the version we started with, the fable of the magic piano wire. It is a comforting, romantic myth. It suggests that a complex problem of high-speed aerodynamics could be solved by a simple country boy tightening a loose string. It appeals to our desire for simplicity, but the piano wire story is aerodynamically illiterate. A loose cable makes a plane sloppy. It doesn't make it stiff. Tightening a wire does nothing to combat the thousands of pounds of air pressure clamping down on a control surface at 400 miles per hour. The truth, the story of the hydraulic tune-up, is far more profound. What Sgt McKenna and the unsung mechanics of the 5th Air Force actually achieved was a fundamental shift in how humans interact with machines. Before this moment, a pilot flew by muscle. His strength was the limit of the aircraft's performance. If the air was too heavy, The pilot was too weak. McKenna's modification severed that link. By amplifying the hydraulic signal, he was treating the pilot not as a laborer, but as a processor. The pilot provided the intent, the machine provided the muscle. This is the great-grandfather of the technology that flies every modern fighter jet today. When an F-22 Raptor executes a maneuver that defies gravity, it is operating on the same principle that McKenna hacked together in a jungle tent. The pilot is merely requesting a movement, and a powered system is fighting the physics to execute it. The legacy of the P-38 isn't just that it helped win the war in the Pacific. Its legacy is that it proved, once and for all, that the limits of an aircraft are not defined by its blueprints, but by the audacity of the men who maintain them. McKenna, Hayes, and Reynolds didn't become household names. They didn't write books. When the war ended, they returned to a world that was rapidly moving into the jet age. The P-38 seconds were scrapped, bulldozed into pits in the Philippines, or melted down for aluminum siding. The illegal valves and the filed-down bell cranks were lost to the smelter. But for a brief, terrifying window in 1943, they proved that the difference between a target and a predator often comes down to a fraction of an inch of steel, hidden where no inspector dares to look. That hidden steel is the only monument men like Technical Sergeant McKenna ever receive. We paint the names of the aces Bong, McGuire, Hayes in bright letters on the nose of the aircraft. We tally their kills and award them the medals. But the name of the man who stayed up for 3 nights straight, filing a valve pin by the light of a red lens flashlight so that the ace could make that turn, exists only in a dusty maintenance log, archived in a warehouse and forgotten. This story isn't just about a hydraulic valve or a misunderstood piano wire. It is a reminder of how innovation actually happens in the crucible of war. It rarely comes from a boardroom in Washington or a design bureau in California. It comes from the bottom up. It comes from the people who have to live with the consequences of the design, the sergeant who sees the blood in the cockpit, the mechanic who realizes that the safety limit is actually a death sentence. The P-38 Lightning started the war as a high-altitude interceptor, hampered by caution and doctrine. It ended the war as the Fork-tailed Devil, a low-altitude brawler that swept the skies of the Pacific. That transformation wasn't dictated by a general. It was engineered by the rebellious ingenuity of men who understood that in combat, the manual is just a suggestion, but physics is the law. But McKenna wasn't the only heretic operating in the jungles of New Guinea. While he was busy turning a heavy fighter into a knife fighter, a few miles away at Port Moresby, a legendary cigar-chomping major named Paul "Pappy" Gunn was staring at the glass nose of a B-25 Mitchell bomber and asking a question that would terrify the Japanese Navy. Gunn didn't care about high-altitude precision bombing. He wanted to know what would happen if you ripped out the bombardier, packed the nose with 8 50-caliber machine guns, and flew the plane directly at a ship at mast height. The engineers said it would throw off the center of gravity. The manual said it was impossible. Pappy Gunn said, "Give me a welding torch. Next time, we are going to climb inside the cockpit of the Commerce destroyer to see how an unauthorized Frankenstein bomber annihilated an entire convoy at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea." If you believe these stories of technical ingenuity and forgotten heroes deserve to be told, hit that like button. It helps us bypass the algorithm's own restrictor valves and get this history to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the story of Pappy Gunn's gunship. And tell us in the comments, what other field modifications changed the course of history? Class dismissed.